This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is Monday, and that means it's time for this 482nd MTG Top 10. This is the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. One of last week's MTG Top 10s looked at the absolute worst life gain cards in the game, and as I promised in that video, this one is going to look at the best life gain cards in the game. We saw last week that there are a lot of bad life gain cards out there. A card that doesn't do anything other than gain you life is typically pretty bad, but there are also a lot of really good life gain cards too. In fact, this list is one of the most impressive ones I've ever done. All 10 cards on it have 100 points or more using my scoring system. Generally, good life gain cards give you some effect in addition to the life gain, and when you're actually adding something to the board and gaining life at the same time, you're talking about a very different thing than a pure life gain card. Gaining life can really help you stabilize, and if you're actually casting a meaningful spell in addition to that, you're making the chances of that much higher. To be eligible for this list, a card had to be able to gain you life, with one exception. I excluded cards with lifelink. This is because I've already done an MTG Top 10 on lifelink, and I updated it fairly recently. But any card that can gain you life, other than with lifelink, was eligible for this list. In the end, there were more than 1,000 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest mark on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours and Mythic Championships, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, and this includes events like Magic Online, Challenges, and Grand Prix. One last thing before we jump into the video, I do want to draw your attention to the fact that there are now YouTube memberships. If you scroll down and click join down below, you'll have the opportunity to become a YouTube member. You support the channel directly, and you also receive some perks. You get to see top 10s and deck history videos 24 hours before everyone else does. You get access to a Discord server, and you get a cool badge that you can see in the comments section. So if you're interested in supporting the channel, that's one way you can do it. Alright, let's get to our list. At number 10, it's Ugin, the Spirit Dragon. He is one of the most powerful things you can ramp into in Magic. He costs 8 mana, but he has a +2 that lets you do 3 damage to anything, a -X which can wipe the board of things that aren't Ugin, and an ultimate that gains you 7 life, draws you 7 cards, and then you can put 7 permanents onto the battlefield. Obviously the ultimate is what qualifies it for this list. Getting to that ultimate really isn't a rare occurrence because he starts with such high loyalty. You can just use the +2 a couple of times to get there, or you can wipe the board and then build his loyalty back up until you can use it. The life you gain, the cards you draw, and the permanents you get to put into play make it impossible for you to lose after you use it. Ugin has been played mostly in various ramp decks in Standard, Historic, Pioneer, and Modern. He saw a ton of play in Standard, and his big score is partly the result of being printed in a Standard legal set 2 different times. The first time around he was played in Devotion to Green in various control decks, and the second time around he was played alongside Omnath, Locus of Creation. He was also played in Omnath decks in Historic. In Pioneer, he's played in Lotus Field decks, and in Modern, he's played in Tron. All of these decks can get Ugin into play early, and that's tough to beat. Ugin looks likely to keep gaining points, and he has a reasonable shot at continuing to move up this list. At number 9, it is Hydroid Crassus. When you cast this creature, you get to gain half X life and draw half X cards. Combining card draw with life gain is powerful, as gaining that life means you're likely to live long enough to take advantage of all the cards you drew. And that's especially true here because you're also getting a relevant body. As long as you pay 2 or more for X, you end up with a nice deal, especially because you get the life and the cards from the crassus whether or not it resolves. And the fact that it has X in its cost means you can always run it out early if you need to, or you can pump a bunch of mana into it. Basically, it's both a win condition and a way to draw more cards and gain life, which goes a long way towards helping you stabilize. The Crassus saw a ton of play in Standard even before the arrival of Oko basically made blue-green decks unbeatable, primarily in Bant and Sultai control decks. Then while Oko was around, the Crassus was one of the key cards in that deck. Then after Oko got banned, the Hydroid Crassus continued to find success in ramp decks, especially those utilizing Nissa who shakes the world. Pumping a ton of mana into Hydroid Crassus is crazy powerful and hard for most decks to beat. The Crassus is one of the most heavily played cards in all of Standard while it was legal there, but it actually hasn't done a whole lot in other formats so far, gaining a few points here and there in both Pioneer and Historic. And it's not close to being a card that you should expect to see there with regularity. It hasn't gained a single point in 2022 so far, so while it has an impressive score right now, it's very likely that it won't be on the list in another year or so. At number 8, it is Siege Rhino. This creature is a 4-mana 4/5 with trample that lightning helixes your opponent in the face when it enters the battlefield. That enter the battlefield trigger is what makes the Rhino great, but he isn't that easy to kill either, as his size puts him out of range of a lot of removal, and trample also makes him hard to block. It was one of the most dominant cards in Standard while it was legal there, and all of that power has meant that Siege Rhino's success hasn't only been contained to Standard, though it hasn't been nearly as dominant outside of that format. Still, it also helped make Abzan decks a thing in Modern, while also gaining points in other decks in the format like Junk and Birthing Pod. It also has some points in Pioneer coming in Niv Mizzet Reborn decks. Siege Rhino seems likely to gain more points going forward, but kind of like Hydroid Crassus, it's probably in some trouble in the long run, especially because it hasn't gained any points since early 2021. At number 7, it is Thrag Tusk. This beast gives you a ton of value. It's a 5-mana 5/3 that gains you 5 life when it enters the battlefield, and when it leaves the battlefield, you also get a 3/3 beast. That's quite the deal for 3 mana. The life gain and the 2 bodies can really help you stabilize, even against more aggressive decks. Unsurprisingly, this powerful creature was played in just about every green deck while it was in Standard. This included decks like Jund, Reanimator, Selesnya Aggro, and Golgari Control. It was especially good alongside Restoration Angel, which if you blinked Thrag Tusk would give you both its enter the battlefield and leave battlefield ability, and obviously that's pretty darn powerful to trigger those and keep Thrag Tusk around. It's also seen a lot of play in Modern. One of the places where it was really sweet was in Birthing Pod decks. You could search it up when you needed the life and the 2 bodies, but you could also sacrifice the Tusk to search up a 6-drop, and you would still have a 3/3 left behind on the board. It's also been played in Tron and Primeval Titan decks, both of which can ramp into it earlier than turn 5. Both of those decks like to buy themselves a bit of time to go off, and Thrag Tusk can definitely do that against aggressive opponents. It will be interesting to see if the recently printed and very similar Workshop War Chief replaces Thrag Tusk some of the time. It gains you less life, but it gives you a bigger token and has Trample and Blitz. It does also cost 2 green mana, and it only gives you the Rhino when it dies and not when it leaves the battlefield more generally, but the 2 cards are pretty similar, so it's hard to say which will become the more popular one. At number 6, it is Lightning Helix. This is one of the best burn spells in the game, and that's because in addition to doing damage, it also gains you 3 life. This makes it an appealing card for burn decks, of course, but also more controlling decks who can really benefit from simultaneously removing a creature and gaining life. While it was played in Block and Standard, Extended was the first format where it truly dominated. It was played there mostly in aggro decks like Burn, Boros Aggro, Red Deck Wins, and Zoo. It has been played the most, by far, in Modern, where it's been played regularly since the format began in 2011. In that format, it's played in a lot of the same types of decks it was played in Extended, in other words, Aggro and Burn, but it's also been played in decks like Jeskai Control and Niv Mizzet. The Helix was reprinted in Strixhaven's Mystical Archive, making it legal in Historic, which it's already gained some points in as well. It's just going to keep adding to its score as we move forward. At number 5, it is Corsair of Kruphix. This is a pretty amazing value engine. Being able to play lands off the top of your library is a big deal, as every time you're able to do that, you're effectively drawing a card. Because you can play lands off the top of your library, this gets you closer to drawing non-lands while also adding to your resources in play, and that's just great. And on top of all of that, it also gains you 1 life every time you have a land enter the battlefield. Gaining life all game long, almost every turn, is pretty effective, especially against more aggressive decks who struggle to attack through the Corsair in the first place. The Corsair was heavily played in both Block and Standard formats where it was effectively a staple, appearing in just about every green deck there was. However, the Corsair has proven itself outside of those formats too. It's been played in Modern, where it's gained the most point in Jund and Valakut. It's the most active in Pioneer these days, having gained points in the past in Sultai Delirium and Omnath Ramp, and more recently, Devotion to Green and Collected Company. It isn't gaining points at the highest rate these days, but it's still likely to be on this list for a while. At number 5, it is Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. Early in the game, Uro is effectively a 3-mana spell that gains you 3 life and lets you explore. Not a bad deal if you're looking to ramp, especially because the stuff it does early makes it more likely you'll survive to the later game. Gaining life and drawing a card is a big deal, along with the extra land drop. Then, in the later part of the game, Uro can escape from the graveyard and start doing that every single time it attacks, too, so Uro is very powerful, and as a result, it's had a large impact on every Magic format. In Standard, it was utterly dominant, showing up in the 2 top decks of the format, which were Bant and Sultai Ramp. It was the most played non-land card at several different Standard events in 2020, contributing to its huge score that came only in a matter of months. Uro also found success in other formats, and ultimately it ended up being banned out of Standard, Historic, Pioneer, and Modern. This may make it more difficult to add to its score, but it's also played in Legacy and seeing a bit of play in Vintage. In Legacy, you can combine Uro with Cavern Harpy and Alurin to draw your whole library and gain a bunch of life and put basically all of your lands into play. Because Alurin lets you play cheap creatures for free and at instant speed, you can flash in the Harpy in response to the sacrifice trigger, then replay Uro, pay the life to return the Harpy, then play it again, and rinse and repeat. So yeah, it's going to keep on gaining points in the Eternal formats, and at a pretty high rate in Legacy especially, so I think it has a good chance at remaining on this list, and maybe even moving up it despite all those bans. At number 3, it is Kitchen Finks. This is a 3-mana 3/2 that gains you 2 life when it enters the battlefield, and it also has Persist, which means when it dies, it comes back with a -1/-1 counter. So it's a 2/1 that gains you 2 more life. So in the end, you pay 3 mana for a 3/2, a 2/1, and 4 life. That's an excellent deal, especially if you're up against an aggressive deck. Gaining the life and being able to trade for 2 of their creatures makes it pretty hard for them to win. The Finks has been played in a lot of decks simply because of how much it gives you for the mana, but it was also an important combo piece to use alongside Melira Sylvok Outcast in Modern. If you add a sacrifice effect to the mix, like Viscera Seer, and sacrifice the Finks to the Seer with Melira in play, the Finks keeps coming back into play without the -1/-1 counter, and that means you can keep sacrificing it as many times as you want to and gain as much life as you want to. This was a combo that was pretty easy to assemble thanks to Birthing Pod, which ultimately got banned because it was too good at assembling creature-based combos like this one. Even after that ban though, the Finks gives you plenty of value for the cost, and as a result, it's been played in a ton of decks in Modern. Collected Company, Jund, Elves, Hate Bear, the list goes on. It's likely to remain on this list going forward. At number 2, it is Deathright Shaman, which is arguably the most powerful 1-drop in the history of Magic. It's really good because it has so many abilities, so many that some jokingly refer to the Shaman as a 1-mana planeswalker, and sometimes it doesn't feel too different from generating value with a loyalty ability every turn. The Shaman can exile cards of various types from the graveyard for value. It can function as a mana dork, allowing you to play 3-mana spells on turn 2, assuming there's a land in the graveyard, like a fetch land, and it can also provide a win condition, slowly killing your opponent by exiling cards in the graveyard, or it can help you stabilize, gaining you much needed life. On top of all of that, the Shaman also happens to provide some graveyard hate since it has to exile cards from graveyards to use its abilities. While it found some success in Standard, its power has been most abused in both Modern and Legacy, formats with easy access to ways to load the graveyard and fetch lands. In Modern, it was mostly featured in Birthing Pod and Jund. It eventually became clear that the card was too good for Modern though, and it got banned from that format in February of 2014. In the short time it was legal there, it amassed 40 points, so banning it was a good call. It continued to be legal in Legacy though, where it was primarily featured in Delver decks. Just like in Modern though, Deathright Shaman eventually proved to be too good for Legacy too, and it was banned in that format in July of 2018. It remains legal in Pioneer and Vintage, and those are 2 formats where it is still seeing significant play. In Pioneer, it's often played alongside Niv Mizzet Reborn, and in Vintage, it has been the most successful in graveyard decks like Bazaar Aggro. You just can't keep Deathright Shaman down, no matter how much you ban it. However, it is unlikely to catch the number 1 card on this list, which is Scavenging Ooze. Kind of like Deathright Shaman, Scavenging Ooze combines graveyard hate and synergy with a powerful effect. It brings a ton of value for a very low investment. It starts out as a 2-mana 2/2, but then it can start gobbling up cards in graveyards, and if you exile creature cards with it, you gain life, and it makes itself bigger. The Ooze is great because it lets you hate on the graveyard while also gaining some additional value, including some important life gain. While it saw some play in Standard, Modern is really where the card has made a name for itself over the years. It's basically a staple in green decks in the format, with Jund, Abzan, and Collected Company decks common homes for it. It also sees some play in Legacy Elf and 4-color control decks. The Ooze is also legal in Pioneer, where it's played in Devotion to Green and various green aggro decks. The Ooze is still rapidly accumulating points, and it's going to be the number 1 card on this list for a while. So, those are the 10 life gain cards that have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you're interested in gaining some life yourself, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the almost 500 MTG top 10s I've already done, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile to support the channel, you can on Patreon or with a YouTube membership or buying some Nita merch. Check out the description for all of those. Thanks for watching.